Hello and welcome to ABC. You are watching Addis Dialog. I'm Seleshi Damso. Today on the plate is Ethiopian 2017 and 2018 budget. The House of People's Representatives has approved 320.8 billion birr, which is close to $13.9 billion for the year. This has shown a 9.6% increase compared to the budget for 2016 and 2017. What does the increment imply, particularly in regards to Ethiopia's ambition of joining middle-income status by 2025? To talk about this and other pressing economic and financial issues, here with me is an independent economist, Zamrina Nagatu. Enjoy the show. Mr. Zamrina Nagatu, an independent economist, welcome to Addis Dialog.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, today I want you to share me your insight on the 2017-2018 Ethiopian budget allocation. So, to begin with, 320.8 billion birr is the amount of money allocated for the fiscal year. So, I want you to share me your insight of this budget, which has increased by 9.6% over the previous year.
Sure. As you indicated, the Ethiopian government's budget for this fiscal year started, I guess, in July 1st, has increased by about 9.7%, something like that. And it's about 320 billion birr, which is approximately $14 billion, 13.9 to be precise. Okay. So the way I look at it is it's in line with the overall economic growth of the economy of the last year, and probably reflects the growth that has happened over the last several years. In other words, if you look at the government's forecast, last year GDP growth was probably around 9.5%. If you look at the World Bank, IMF forecast, it's around that 8.5%, something like that. So the increase is pretty much in line with the economic activity. Budget reflects economic activity, right? Because it's derived from the source, which is the tax base, the government's ability to collect from the economic activities and translate it into a budget that will ultimately be deployed to help stimulate the economy. So in summary, the growth is in line with the overall economic activity of the country.
Nice. From experience, Ethiopia's yearly budget allocation has a growing trend,
right.
But the latest one is higher by 9.6%. Compared to the 13.7% increment of the 2016-2017 budget. Having local and global economic scenarios, what's your take on this?
It would be good to actually compare the Ethiopian budget to the experience of some of our neighboring countries, so that we have a frame of reference if this is an appropriate budget and the size and the deployment. So maybe if you allow me, just very briefly, I'll give you a comparison of Ethiopia's budget, starting with our immediate neighbor, Kenya. So Kenya, this year, their budget in dollar terms, converted from local currency to dollars, is approximately $25 billion. The Ethiopian budget that we just mentioned was about 13.9 billion, rounded to 14 billion. So their budget is actually 11 billion more than Ethiopia's. Here's the interesting part, though. Ethiopia's GDP is bigger than Kenya's. So something has to give. How come they're in a position to budget 11 billion more than us? It's primarily because their ability to collect taxes is much more stronger, more sophisticated than Ethiopia's. And we see this in the numbers. If you look at Kenya's tax to GDP ratio, it's approximately 18.4%. If you look at Ethiopia's, it's under 14%. That 4.5% alone can account for a significant portion of the difference between Ethiopia's $14 billion budget and Kenya's $25 billion. So I think it's good to keep this in mind as we discuss the budget of Ethiopia.
Well, now let's get back to the practical allocation. 61% of the total amount of money allocated for the year goes to infrastructure, agriculture, education, water and health. What does this budgeting imply given that the country is like enjoying
Right.
double-digit growth over the years, like a decade ago?
Very good point. Very good question. So let's dissect the sectors that you just mentioned. Agriculture. We're an economy in transition, but we're still 85% of Ethiopians still live in the rural areas. It's heavily agricultural-driven economy, right? So to allocate a very significant portion of the budget to agriculture is appropriate. It's just reflecting the realities. In fact, if you were to look at GDP2 and beyond, how would the Ethiopian economy transform? On the back of agriculture, right? If you look at the industrial parks, Hawassa Industrial Park, what is it? Garments. Where is the raw material going to come from? Cotton and other things from the agriculture. So it's important to understand that the budget is reflecting the realities of the Ethiopian economy today, where the Ethiopian economy is going to be going on the next 5 to 10 years. So agriculture, infrastructure, as I said, especially the power sector. Without power, you can't have you cannot have industrialization. The Achilles heel of Africa, Africa's challenge over the years of industrialization is lack of power. Here is Ethiopia allocating a very significant portion of its budget to the power sector. The Grand Renaissance Dam is a very, very good example of allocating appropriate budget to the appropriate sector. When that dam is finished in a couple years from now, Ethiopia will be producing approximately 11,000 megawatts. It can export it, and a lot of it could be used for the industrialization of the country. So again, the budget is reflecting that. But you picked up on something which I also like very much, which is the education sector. Look at this. This year, there are over 600,000 students in colleges and universities in Ethiopia. 600,000.
More than 500,000.
Exactly. To me, that's a big asset. Now, it depends how you use it, how you deploy it, but it's a big asset. I was in Asia a couple weeks ago on a business tour, and you look around the countries I was at, and none of them produce a single barrel of oil. None. The Asian countries I visited. And yet, they're amongst the richest countries on earth. Why? They invested in education. They invested in people, the kinds of questions that you raise. So, for us as a country to allocate a very significant portion of the budget to education is absolutely a must. If we're going to become a middle-income country, it's going to be, as I say, on the back of transformation of agriculture, manufacturing, but all of them have one theme in common: talent. So that's 600,000 kids coming out of colleges, 150,000 every year, as you know, this summer. That's the asset of Ethiopia, so the budget needs to reflect that as well.
Nice. Earlier you raised the budgeting experience of neighboring countries, right, including Kenya, but now I want you, if you have any, to tell me is the experience of budgeting they apply other than Kenya, like it could be from neighboring countries or whatsoever part of the continent of Africa.
Sure. I started with Kenya just because they're our neighbors, but I go down to South Africa, for example, which is the most industrialized country on the African continent. South Africa is the second largest economy in Africa after Nigeria. This year, the South African government's budget is more than $100 billion. The GDP is about 300 billion, but they are able to allocate $100 billion, 1/3 of their GDP, because they can collect very efficiently, very effectively from taxes and other sources. So that means they have the flexibility of addressing the public's need in a much bigger way. But I contrast that, if I take you to West Africa, to Nigeria, which is the biggest economy in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa.
In Africa as well.
In Africa actually as well. And South Africa is second.
Sure.
And yet, Nigeria's budget is only $27 billion. South Africa is over 100 billion. Second largest. Nigeria is the largest.
Sure.
And it only collects 27. In fact, it doesn't have a budget much bigger than Kenya. Kenya is, the 5th or 6th largest economy in Africa. So this is also one lesson we should learn, that maybe that's, there's something you can learn from others, let's call it mistakes. Nigeria only collects 2% of its GDP from taxes. 2%. So the government doesn't have the flex. They rely on oil, of course. That's the main reason. But So you asked me what is the experience. I mean, you have a very effective system in South Africa. You have a pretty strong, effective system right next door to us in Kenya. And then you can learn that maybe that the way they're doing it in Nigeria is also a cautionary tale for others. Maybe there's a different way of doing it. So we can learn from other
infrastructure, agriculture, education, water and health are the areas that take more than 0.5% of the total budget the country allocated for the coming year. Is there any area you may suggest that needs more attention than the ones mentioned earlier?
Let's put it this way. Today, manufacturing accounts for less than 5% of GDP. By 2025, the hope is it will be more than 20%, 20, 22, maybe even 25%. By then, what it means is the elements of the budget that went to help support the manufacturing sector, the roads, the bridges, the power dams, would no longer need to be allocated as much from the government's budgets. So then the government will allocate its budget to other value additions, to other components of the economy that would sustain. So we're, for example, going into garments and textiles and the low end of it. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll move up the value chain. So the budget will allocate more of it to elements that will make Ethiopia a more knowledge-based economy, a competitive economy globally from that perspective. So the component of it would change, okay? But these will still be very important sectors. I mean, listen, when we talk about these 4 or 5, it doesn't mean that nothing. The other component, of course, is, Ethiopia is a federal system, like the United States, where I grew up. So the federal government is allocating more and more to the regions because the whole makes the top stronger. So I would expect more and more of allocation from the center, from the federal government, to the regional governments, because that's where I'll give you urbanization as an example for the budget allocation. Today, as we said earlier, 85% of Ethiopians live in the rural area, so it's an agrarian economy. But if you were to look at 20 years from now, maybe 40% of Ethiopians will be living in urban areas. Okay, so the allocation for urban development might get more attention, both at the federal level and at the regional level. So what I'm looking at is the component of allocation would be different as the economy evolves over the years. And we see this in other countries as well. You would throw it from one area because it doesn't need it as much anymore, and you allocate it to other areas. 25 years ago, it was public enterprise, state-owned enterprises that were paying all the taxes, they were driving the economy, what little economy there was. But now already we can see the private sector is starting to wake up, to become bigger and bigger. It's still a young private sector.
Sure.
And then in the next 10, 15 years, you will see a bigger role by the private sector. So the budget then will allocate more and more of it to help support the needs of a private sector, especially the domestic private sector. I mean, the big international companies, multinationals, or just any international company, they can come with the 2 C's, what I call the financial capital and the human capital. I mean, they come from whether China and India or Turkey, or they come from much more advanced economies where those kinds of the 2 C's are readily available. Our private sector, though, is indigenous.
Sure.
It's grown by itself, so it needs more support. So I would expect the government to be allocating more of its budget to support our private sector, because we want our private sector to dominate the economy. We love foreign direct investment. We're always promoting them to come, and that will continue. But equally, or even more important, is to build up our own multinationals, our own champions, our own Samsungs and Hyundais or whatever, or Toyotas. Our version of those need to be created, and that comes from smart allocation from the government's budget. So this is some of the things that I've thought about that I hope will start happening in the next few years.
That is pretty nice idea. Here comes another point.
Yeah.
61% of the budget is projected to come from tax revenue.
Right.
How practical could that be in your perspective, given our tax collecting system
right
on the ground?
We can learn from other countries, our neighboring countries and other countries in Africa. Kenya collects 18.4%, South Africa 32%, and a few others in between. So I'm not suggesting we should get there tomorrow. We have a different history, the realities of Ethiopia are different, But at some point, we got to get there, right? So gradually. The way to do that is to make the system sophisticated. Use technology more, but also educate the private sector. It's a new private sector. It needs to understand what it means to pay taxes, how it pays taxes, and also for the government to feel like, to make sure that the private sector understand it's a partner of the government. They both are in it together. There's no either or. So one part of it is to educate people that what I collect, the government will say, what I collect from you, here's what I'm doing with it. Okay, X, Y, and Z. And then if something is misallocated, I have the Auditor General at the federal level, the local levels, they'll keep an eye on everybody, okay? I have the system, feel comfortable. The taxpayer also say, wait a second, what types of services am I receiving for my taxes? And the tax collector has to show that, the government has to show it. So it's an equal partnership, and that's how you build trust, that's how you build, but you gotta use technology.
For over a decade now, Ethiopia has been registering double-digit growth.
Right.
Though per capita income has reached only $794,
Right.
Which used to be $396.66 before.
Right.
It is still one of the lowest in Africa. I want you to share me your take on this.
So again, this is a very interesting question, which we get asked a lot, right? So when we look at the aggregate GDP, okay, it's the fourth largest in Africa. We came from nowhere 20 years ago. 25 years ago in terms of aggregate to the fourth largest. Very good. But as you said, we have 100 million people. In maths is easy. You know, you take the total divided by 100 million people, you get to $800.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it is. Because the GDP is around 80 billion. Now, what we need to do is sustain that high growth so that per capita GDP, which to me is the true test of growth, continues to grow. We're looking at between 11-12% per capita GDP growth annually, which is pretty good. But we still have a long ways to go, right? You know what middle income means? The low end of middle income is around $1,250, around $1,300, it's just rounded. So we still need to get another $500 per capita in the next 8 to 9 years to be in middle income countries. That means the overall GDP growth has to be sustained at 8, 9, or 10%. Because population growth is about 2.5 million per year. So you're raising a very good fundamental point, which is we still are at the low end on a per capita, but if we sustain this kind of growth, I think that 1,250 or 1,300 per capita to make us a middle income country is achievable, especially if the manufacturing sector performs well. And you know, I'm always asked about GTP. I will tell you, and I'll link it to the budget. GTP, what is GTP? To me, GTP2, the big document, I distill it into one sentence: export or die. Manufacture or die. I mean, I know it sounds very extreme, but that's the path we're on. Either we export very large volumes on the back of value-added manufacturing. When I talk about manufacturing, it includes agro-processing, by the way. Okay, it's not just producing cars or garments and things like that, agro-processing. If we do that, I assure you, middle income is achievable. There's very high probability of achieving that.
You are pretty optimistic that Ethiopia could achieve
Right.
middle income status by 2025, but I want you to get me an idea of what should be done to keep the current economic growth trajectory going on.
Right, you're absolutely right. I am optimistic. My optimism comes from what Ethiopia has been doing, comparing it to my experience in other countries, what they did right and how they got it right, and are we bringing it. So you're asking me what would it take for the economy to sustain this. One, we got to move on to a value addition economy, okay? Especially, of course, manufacturing. There's no alternative to that. But within manufacturing is, of course, the agricultural component, a very sophisticated agricultural transformation. I think those two are important. Third, investment in human capital. I mean, Ethiopia's biggest asset, actually, is its people. If you educate 100 million Ethiopians at various levels, from TVETs to colleges, universities, that is your power base for economic transformation. Building strong institutions, especially on the public sector side. You see, what's happening now is you're transforming from a command-controlled socialist economy 25 years ago to a private sector-led economy as we go along, right? What the private sector needs to do is understand that it now has a very sophisticated partner called the private sector. It needs to elevate its game. So building institutions on the public sector side, I think is also very, very important. That a public sector that says, you know what, the one on the other side, the private sector is my partner. How am I going to support them to grow? That's the kind of problem. So building the institutions. But we're also starting, I'll give you a very last data, just to keep it. A couple of days ago, there was an announcement that the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, the state-owned financial institutions, they released their total financial figures for this year. But I looked into the details and I saw that the total assets of the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia was about $20.5, $20.6 billion. I said, what does that mean? Because I like context, right? So we looked into our database. The total asset, this goes back to my point about building strong institutions.
Sure.
The total asset of CBE is bigger than the 5 biggest banks in Kenya combined. So,
that's a nice analysis.
It is, see? But the question then is CBE as efficient, as technologically savvy as the Kenyan banks? It's 5 times bigger. It's bigger than all 5 Kenyan banks. Combined. So we now have the size. We just have to make sure the ability to deliver on that size is there. This is what I'm talking about, institutions. I was very impressed to see that. I should have known because every year, I'm a judge at the Africa Bankers Award. So I see a lot of bankers, but this time I was really struck by the magnitude of CBE's size. So we built a very large institution. We just have to make sure CBE operates at that level in a global scale. That's what I'm saying. So you look at Ethiopia as a whole, we need to build very sophisticated. You know what's going to happen in the next few years? Ethiopia will generate multinationals like Ethiopian Airlines. You will see. In the construction sector, the same people who are building the Grand Renaissance Dam, next time they'll build a big dam. They have the capacity to build a dam across Africa, whether it's in Kenya or Nigeria, because they have built up that world-class capacity. This is what our vision should be. We're talking about budget. That's what the budget will reflect in the future. We're a very large country. We're going to act like that economically as well, because we will have the institute. Look at Ethiopian Airlines. It's the dominant airline in Africa, created right here by us Ethiopians. And I think all our Ethio Telecom will be like that, EPCO will be like that. I just told you CBE will be like, CBE will be an international bank. So this is my view of where we think we're going. And I know this being a budget program, I think the budget would in the future reflect these kinds of activities.
It's really a pretty wonderful idea. I'm also hopeful the best is yet to come.
Right.
Mr. Zamadene Nagatu, an independent economist, thanks for sharing me your insight.
Well, listen, thank you for having me once again. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
That was all we have for this edition of Addis Dialogue. Hope you have enjoyed the show. It is goodbye from me, Slash Damso, and the entire crew. Goodbye for now.